To recap, I had a few people ask me if I watched the FriendlyJordies video on the Housing Australia Future Fund and whether or not I was going to pull together a video looking at it. My initial response was, yeah, no thanks. It runs for 65 minutes, which is over half the running time of the Chronicles of Riddick. Against my better judgment though, I caved. I watched it, and here we are. This is part 2.
Here we go again.
Looking at the second half of his video, which talks about things like rent control, the research behind that, how bad the Greens are, and basically anything else to distract you from what the HAFF actually is.
A turd sandwich.
Part 1, which you can check out here, looks at the first half of the video, which was, in general, more focused on the HAFF itself. Well, sort of. Alright, let's take a look at the main points. Another of the bad faith arguments you'll see when talking about the HAFF are around a rent freeze or rent caps.
The federal Australian government can't enforce rent controls.
No, they can't, and I haven't seen anyone ask nor expect the federal government to enforce rent controls either. I have seen people call for the Prime Minister to coordinate things like a rent freeze via the National Cabinet process, which is something that can be done if there's enough political will to do so. The problem here is that there's not enough political will to do so. I mean, there was a valid point here. There's a lot of hyperbole on political websites these days. And the Greens definitely could use someone to proofread the content on their website. But if you think the Red Team are any better on the hyperbole front...
The Greens are blocking Anthony Albanese's realistic $10 billion plan to build 30,000 homes, unless he spends 7 times his planned spend. That's their idea of compromise. Every day they delay is $1.3 million less that can be spent on affordable homes. Housing experts and industry leaders all back Labor's plan. So let's start building. Sign our petition. Stop the Greens blocking affordable homes.
Yeah, they put that out. Labor continue to double down on their claim that the HAFF is going to build 30,000 homes within its first 5 years. I mean, what can I say?
They won't.
If only the government hadn't sided with the coalition to make sure the Stop the Lies bill didn't get through. Imagine that. National Cabinet can move mountains when there's enough will to do so. There's a whole bunch of time spent on this paragraph from an article that's on the Greens website. While it's presented as some sort of official policy position held by the federal Greens, that's not what this article is at all. What's not mentioned here is that this article is from the Western Australian Greens newsletter and is presented with a disclaimer down the bottom. Opinions expressed are those of the author and not official policy of Greens WA. Yeah, the guy who pulls together the newsletter for the WA Greens wrote an article. Remember the time the ACT Labor called on their federal colleagues to do better and invest more in social and affordable housing, raise their targets and address the design flaws of the HAFF? Nah, let's talk about an article written for a newsletter in which the opinions expressed are those of the author and not official policy instead. Pesky context aside, what the article attempted to do, through a very green lens it must be said, is take a very high level look at the for and against arguments for a rent freeze. It's worth pointing out that a rent freeze, rent caps and rent controls are all technically different things. There's a handy explainer here worth checking out if you're interested, but just keep it in mind when looking at any research or listening to any commentary on this subject. So back to this paragraph. We can talk about research on this topic until the cows come home, but this sentence here best sums up the point. When it comes to research on this issue, like a lot of things, you can find a report or expert to provide evidence to back up whatever your preconceived view is. In fact, you'll often find evidence to support the pros and cons for the argument within the same article or report if you look hard enough. This article is about a study done in San Francisco which has had rent control in one form or another in place since 1979. This particular study looks at rent control expansion in San Francisco in 1994 on small multifamily housing built before 1980. So yeah, it's a pretty specific study. The actual paper is pretty heavy going and there's lots of models and beautiful mind style maths, but you'll be able to find something in there to support whatever case you're trying to make. Yep, it found that the 1994 expansion did lead to a reduction in supply. But on the flip side, the study also found that rent control increased renters' probability of staying at their address, and that rent control offered large benefits to covered tenants. I mean, that's a good thing, right? So yep, within the one paper you can say rent control is good, and you can also say it's bad. For me though, this study highlighted that while there were pros and cons to the San Francisco example, the cons were not entirely impossible to mitigate. In San Francisco, generally any residential units constructed from June 1979 onward are exempt from the rent increase limitation of the rent control policy. So what the study found was that yes, there was a reduction in supply, but it also identified that this reduction was driven by landlords demolishing their old houses and building new rental housing to exploit the new construction loophole and get around the rental increase limitations. The report itself flagged another alternative mitigation.
Using a dynamic neighbourhood choice model, we find rent control offered
Large
benefits to covered tenants. Welfare losses from decreased housing supply could be mitigated if insurance against rent increases were provided as government social insurance instead of a regulated landlord mandate.
If a country or jurisdiction was willing to learn the lessons from San Francisco, there just might be a workable policy in there. In my view, all this research talk has to come with a bit of a caveat. Arguing for or against a rent freeze while pointing to international research or examples can often be a bit of a stretch anyway, whatever side of the argument you land on. A lot of the studies and articles you'll see on the subject don't really align with what has been proposed here, and a lot of the times they're not even talking about the exact same thing. It's a little bit apples and oranges in my opinion. A lot of the research you see referred to is not like for like stuff. I mean, this San Francisco report is about an event that occurred 30 years ago in a city that has had some form of rent control for almost 45 years. This study pointed to here was from 2007 and it looks at rent control in New Jersey over a 30-year period.
Yeah, but
Show me your research.
If it's research you want, here's a study done by Berkeley in the United States in 2018 that found that rent control is a cost-effective policy with immediate effects, the disadvantages of rent control do not outweigh its benefits, and that claims that rent control has negative effects on development of new housing are generally not supported by research. Or there's this one from the Centre for Urban and Regional Affairs and the University of Minnesota from 2021 that found empirical research indicates that rent regulations have been effective at achieving two of their primary goals, maintaining below market rent levels and moderating price appreciation, that there was widespread agreement in the empirical literature that rent regulation increases housing stability for tenants, and there's little empirical evidence that shows that rent control policies negatively impact new construction. Well, there's Gary Painter from the University of Southern California, who suggests that rent control can actually lead to developers building more units. Whatever, in case the point isn't clear, yet when it comes to rent freezes, caps or controls, if you have a preset opinion, you'll have no problem finding evidence to back up your position. I think we've already established that this Country X and Berlin stuff is really not the point. If you read the paragraph in full, you'll realise that this is the point. In summary, it appears that in some places and times, rent controls do produce negative consequences, while in others they appear to benefit tenants in important ways, without any obvious downsides. It's nonsense to reject this solution outright because it will automatically and always do more harm than good. Real life is far more complicated. We're currently in an emergency situation for renters and therefore mere tinkering solutions simply don't cut it.
I looked for that source, couldn't find it.
this is the smoking gun.
For what it's worth, I haven't found those exact words either. What I do know though is that the Berlin rent freeze ran from February 2020 until April 2021. And while I couldn't find these exact words, I did find that housing stock in Berlin increased by 0.7% between 2019 and 2020, and then increased a further 0.8% between 2020 and 2021. So you can actually say that housing stock in Berlin continued to increase throughout the relatively short rent freeze period. Again, I don't think Berlin and whether or not this statement source was appropriately referenced is all that important to the point that the guy who wrote the newsletter article was making, but it is what it is. Mr. Delves, you're a bad man for not providing a source. If you had, you might have saved me a bunch of time. It's probably a good time to remind everyone that this newsletter article has nothing to do with Labour's public enemy number one. Alright, let's quickly talk about Berlin because it's a place that comes up often when discussing rent freezes. And if I don't mention it, there'll just be a bunch of, "Yeah, what about Berlin? You didn't talk about that, did ya?" in the comments. There are a number of factors that set the short-lived rent freeze in Berlin apart from any ideas that are being thrown around in Australia right now. Let's start with the obvious. In Australia, approximately 31% of people rent. In Germany, just over half the population rent, which is the highest percentage of any country in the EU. In Berlin though, well, Berlin takes renting to a whole new level. 85% of the Berlin population rent. That's massive. For context, Greater Sydney, which is above the national Australian average, comes in at just under 36%. It would appear that renting is just ingrained into the Berlin culture. There seems to be an almost unspoken assumption by rent freeze critics that Berlin's rent freeze law was ultimately overturned because it was going badly. This is not the case. The Berlin rent freeze was ruled null and void in
April
2021 due to a ruling by the German Constitutional Court, and the matter went to the Constitutional Court following complaints from the government's opposition. The court found that the rent freeze was unconstitutional as the federal government had rental regulation laws put in place 120 years prior, and that Berlin's state government had no right to introduce laws that would infringe on those already in place at the federal level. So the ruling had nothing to do with whether or not the rent freeze had been good or bad. It was purely a constitutional thing. When it comes to actual data and evaluating the success or failure of the rent freeze in Berlin, to be honest, I couldn't find much. That could be partly due to the fact that Ich spreche Deutsch. It could also be that the freeze itself wasn't in place long enough to get enough meaningful data. Or it could be that peer-reviewed academic research is still in the works and just hasn't come out yet. The only real study I could find was this one, which seems to have formed the backbone of most of the articles I've seen written on the Berlin rent freeze, including the one highlighted here. The version I found appears to have been revised since this article was written. Regardless, the study found that the rent freeze reduced the cost of rents significantly. It also found that the number of advertised rentals dropped. The study also states that, although successful in reducing rents during its duration, the consequences for Berlin's rental market and adjacent municipalities are not clear. So you can take from that whatever you like. It's worth highlighting here that the Berlin rent freeze started in February 2020 and ran for just over 12 months. Can anyone else remember what kicked off around that time that might have impacted people's ability or desire to move house, and therefore have contributed to a reduction in advertised rentals? Combine the facts that the rent freeze meant that people were actually able to afford their rents, and therefore were less likely to move, with the fact that it was the height of the pandemic, and I think you've got the start of a pretty decent hypothesis as to why the number of advertised rentals dropped. In my opinion, sure, there's probably things that can be learned from the Berlin experience. But just how much of what happened in Berlin in 2020 can be applied to the present day Australian situation, I'm not so sure. Whether you're this guy or this guy, I don't think pointing at Berlin as an example to use in a for or against argument for a rent freeze in Australia is really all that useful. It's all a bit apples and oranges for me. I'll finish the Berlin stuff with this. It's clear that there was a lot of negative reporting around the Berlin experiment. But given the lack of independent study, I'd be interested to find out how much of that was driven by those with property and real estate interests. In the past week or so, there have been stories coming out of Germany suggesting that their federal government are looking to introduce a 3-year nationwide rent freeze. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. So that's Berlin. What was I talking about that again? Yeah, because a guy wrote a newsletter article in Western Australia. Geez, I'd almost forgotten about how bad the Housing Australia Future Fund is as well. Just quickly, back to this 2007 New Jersey study. Yep, it did find that of the New Jersey cities surveyed, the impacts of rent control over a 30-year period were minimal. But that's not to say that the impacts weren't beneficial. As the study says, at best, it appears that most rent control ordinances have only succeeded in preventing rent increases that are excessive. These ordinances have also provided protection against arbitrary evictions, incentives for maintenance of rentals, and knowledge to tenants about the level of rent increases to expect in the future. I mean, none of that seems particularly bad for tenants, does it? New Jersey is an interesting one. New Jersey itself does not actually have any statewide rent controls in place. However, each municipality within New Jersey can enforce its own rent control laws, and those laws can vary from municipality to municipality. Then there was this finding, which I think gets a lot closer to the heart of the rent control issue. Our research suggests that the pressure of real estate groups, government, and the courts has made modern day rent control laws toothless in terms of their impact on rents. Now let me get my tinfoil hat out real quick, but in a lot of my reading on this topic, there's been a theme bubbling along below the surface in many of the international examples.
The interest groups profiting from the housing industry are the most vocal critics of any rent controls.
In my opinion, New Jersey is just another example I wouldn't be pointing towards to support a for or against argument for a rent freeze, whether I was this guy or this guy. Ironically, perhaps the most balanced view of a rent freeze and how it could be applied in Australia comes from the guy that wrote the WA Greens newsletter. There's widespread agreement, at least in progressive circles, that a huge, generously funded program of building public housing is the best solution to the housing affordability crisis. However, in the long years while this essential big build is being done, a short to medium term rental freeze or other forms of rent control make good sense, as long as they don't extend for many years when negative consequences are perhaps more likely to appear. And just in case you forget, this whole section of the video is the result of an article someone wrote for the WA State newsletter. And after 20 minutes or so of all that, you might have actually forgotten about the Housing Australia Future Fund and how bad it is.
A turd sandwich.
But maybe that was the point. There's a whole bunch of gear about that time Elbow did a song and dance routine, selectively quoting an almost 6-month-old article while adding his own little herbs and spices around the edges. Remember, the PM said this.
He went on to say this: we're opposing 30,000 social and affordable homes because...
Max Chandler Mather then said this.
Prime Minister, in question time today, in quoting an article I wrote in Jacobin, said that the article said 30,000 homes, as the Prime Minister said, were being opposed. Those words do not at any point appear in the article.
And the fact is, the article does not say the Greens are opposing 30,000 social and affordable homes. You can probably understand why the Greens would want that record corrected. If anything, the article questions how the HAFF will actually deliver on its promises, and to be very clear, the 30,000 figure appears in the article only once. But yes, go read the article for yourself, and ask yourself why pushing the government to do better is actually such a bad thing.
This bill has the biggest increase in 30 years in rental assistance for low-income renters. They're blocking that bill because the government won't cave to their insane psychotic demands.
Wow. The Housing Australia Future Fund bill provides nothing in terms of rental assistance. Please read the bill.
I had a look around for the 640,000 people that need social and affordable housing stat that the Greens repeat as one of their cult mantras, because I'm starting to notice something about the Greens. Nothing they say is true.
Well, I had a look around too, and it really didn't take me that long to find. In a University of New South Wales report prepared for the Community Housing Industry Association in November 2022, they estimated that there were currently over 640,000 Australian households whose housing needs were not being met. They provided the number of current stock, the current unmet need, and the amount of stock required in 2041 to meet future need. But sure, you can find other figures as well. In a 2018 report, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute put the unmet need at 433,000 households as at 2016. I think we can probably agree things haven't exactly improved since 2016, and even based on the 2016 projections that were done at the time, we were looking at 600,000 plus in 2023. Then there's the 2023 Oxford Economics report commissioned by the CFMEU, who you may remember described the Labor government's housing policies as
way too timid.
That report estimated a current gap of just over 750,000 social and affordable dwellings in Australia. So sure, there are varying figures around, but they all have one thing in common. They are all in the hundreds of thousands, and for what it's worth, 640,000 is a decent midpoint from what I've seen. Apparently anyone that says this is talking hogwash, so I'll leave that to the Housing Minister.
We anticipate probably in the first 12 months we'd get a return, guaranteeing a $500 million disbursement from 2024 to 25 each and every year.
I mean, yeah, this is how the fund is designed to work. The government borrow money, they invest that money, they wait for a return, then they allocate funding at the discretion of the Housing Minister. Labor policy apparently is
very ambitious, very comprehensive, visionary. This is unbelievably forward-thinking, but you watch, look down in the comments section, the 300 charging in with their war cry. That's not good enough, for reasons I've probably already debunked in this video.
Are you having a laugh? Is he having a laugh?
Just to recap, Australia has a social and affordable housing crisis. The problem is currently this big and is only expected to get bigger. The government are pitching the HAFF as the
centrepiece
of their housing policy, their response to the problem, and they're selling it as a massive investment. They say they'll spend $500 million per year and build 30,000 social and affordable homes within 5 years. Given this problem, do you really want to try and argue that this response is good enough? I mean, really? When we know that the government will be spending significantly more on other things of at best questionable value.
Pause it there.
Let that sink in.
How can you argue that this is good enough?
What they want, as in what they're actually buying, is the lie. The lie is what they want because the lie is comforting. They don't want to face the reality that a global cost of living crisis sucks.
You'd almost be talking about the rusted-on Labor stands more than willing to die on the HAFF hill here. It's those people that are more than willing to buy the lie that the HAFF is ambitious and visionary. It's those people that are willing to buy the lie that the HAFF is good enough, that the government couldn't possibly do more. For me, that's not a lie worth selling. For what it's worth, I didn't think I'd live long enough to see the day when FriendlyJordies used Jackie Lambie to defend poor Labor policy, but we live in interesting times. Look, I'm sure there are people lining up to call me a green shill, so for absolute transparency, I do not have any form of a relationship with the Greens or any political party or politician for that matter. I've not taken money or sought out sponsorship opportunities with any party or party-affiliated organisation. I'm one guy on the internet who just happens to think the HAFF is a dog turd of a policy and who's honestly just a little fed up with all the attempted turd polishing. What I'd say to people is it's okay to expect more from whichever team you choose to support. You don't need to accept any old crap they shovel your way. If you just sit back and swallow it quietly, then you better get used to the taste of a turd sandwich, because once you've shown that's what you'll willingly accept, you can all but guarantee there'll be plenty more headed your way. So did I miss anything? Get anything wrong? I'm sure you'll let me know. Peace.
Is he having a laugh?
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.